Here's what you're missing over at patreon.com/Addressing Gettysburg.
You're listening to Addressing Gettysburg.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this episode of Addressing Gettysburg. And today we are talking about the book Spectacle of Grief by Sarah Purcell. It's available through the University of North Carolina Press. And we're going to discuss the death of Stonewall Jackson and all of the funeral stuff that goes around with it. And in the 19th century America in general as well. So, Sarah, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So first of all, what made you want to write about this?
Well, actually, I'm a scholar of national identity, and I wrote a previous book about the memory of the Revolutionary War and the way that helped to create national identity. And as part of that, I examined funerals for, among other people, George Washington and martyrs who were killed during the Revolutionary War, like Joseph Warren, Richard Montgomery. So then when I became more interested and focused on memory of the Civil War, which is a really important topic, right, as we all know, in the history of the Civil War. I just became sensitized to the way that some of the themes that I had looked at for the early Republican period, the first few decades of U.S. history, were still present and still functioning in Civil War history, and that I thought that I could make a contribution by connecting those things. And so funerals just became more and more interesting to me, especially these large public funerals that were for significant individuals like Jackson. And I sort of put it as lots of people know about Abraham Lincoln's funeral, or maybe Ulysses S. Grant's funeral, or possibly Jefferson Davis's funeral. So we know presidents' funerals, but there actually were a lot of other people who had very large, very significant public funerals, including some of the things we recognize from Lincoln's funeral, like their bodies traveling long distances and large amounts of outpouring of public grief in print culture and visual culture. And I got more and more into it, and that's what turned into the book, was to see the way that these large public funerals for people other than presidents, people you might not necessarily have expected, helped to shape the general trend of Civil War memory, really from even before the war. The first chapter is about Henry Clay and the lead up to the Civil War. He died in 1852, until the turn of the 20th century, and kind of looking at various case studies in different chapters.
Was the way the South handled funerals different than the North, or is this generally a 19th century American way of doing things?
Yeah, it's a great question. Generally, there are many, many similarities. There are, I would say that both the South and the North, both the Confederacy and the Union, were part of an American tradition. They were coming out of the colonial revolutionary early 19th century eras of American national identity, the praise for heroic figures, a lot of the things that they did to mourn people between church services, but also newspapers and magazines and engravings and things like that. The forms are all very similar. Now, what splits then is, of course, during the run-up to the war, and of course during the Civil War, the two sides absolutely split on the content, the way they're using the funerals, and the way that those messages are kind of reinforcing U.S. national identity, or what becomes Confederate identity. And then what I trace, though, is the way that kind of comes back together. And it's interesting because one of the things I argue is that as encapsulated in these public funerals, Confederate identity, its promoters seek to make it back into a part of U.S. identity. So Confederate identity is part of U.S. national identity. Now, that doesn't mean it meant the same thing, right? And it was still very contested, so for instance, the memory of great Black Americans like Frederick Douglass, who's part of the last chapter, his funeral, is super contested. So there's a contest between Black emancipationist memory in his funeral procession and a sort of post-Confederate backlash against that. Sort of grudging respect for him, but a different take on, what his notoriety and fame really meant for people. But the forms are quite similar. There are some differences during the war era. There are a few religious differences. Different denominations predominate in the North and South, but the religious services are always kind of not a small part, but a part of the ceremony within the larger publicity of the funeral. It's not just the actual burial service itself that I'm talking about, but actually the whole mechanism of cultural celebration. And so the church services sometimes play, almost the denomination is almost beside the point in a few cases. But so there are some denominational differences. And I guess I would say the other difference during the war is that especially, we see this with Stonewall Jackson's example that we're going to talk about in a minute. Confederates are not able to muster quite the same level of widespread politicized funeral as most Northerners are, because the war is going on in their midst. And also things like newspaper publication and magazine publications are curtailed because of paper shortages and the need for people to evacuate and the movement of refugees, things like that. So a lot of what we see during the war years is Southerners trying to carry on these large funeral processions, large celebrations, but in actuality, they're not as large as some of the ones that take place in the North, but just because of the conditions of the war. They also, in both cases, and I would say in a magnified way for the Confederates, the public funerals for someone like Stonewall Jackson also tie to more private mourning rituals. And sometimes those cross a line between private and public. But someone like Turner Ashby, for instance, where there's a special emphasis on women's role as mourners. I think that's especially heightened in the Confederacy, and it becomes a part of the basis of the creation of ladies' memorial associations after the war, and even as they then turn to become the Daughters of the Confederacy. So that notion that Southern women, Confederate women, white women have a particular role as preservers of male heroism and men's sacrifice in the war, that is tied to personal family styles of mourning in the Confederacy. And I think that a special role for women is super added in the Southern example. So that would be another slight difference, more of a difference in emphasis than a real difference. It's the same phenomenon with slightly different emphasis in different sections.
I know the lost cause develops later, but during the war is anything that would later become part of the lost cause religion kind of taking seed?
Absolutely. I think Stonewall Jackson's public mourning is probably one of the moments you can see that the most strongly, because it has, he is killed what we would call friendly fire, right? I mean, right. He was killed accidentally, and there is a sort of heroic tragedy in that fact. And he is mourned as a martyr to the cause of the Confederacy, even though in actuality he was accidentally killed by men on the same side. Mm-hmm. And so, and sort of lost at the height of his powers, and the height of his, what was then, maybe it wouldn't have been the height, right, if he had continued to live, but a military genius, kind of, Christian soldier. So the kind of glory that then turns into the tragedy of a loss. And then he himself is hailed as an icon to be mourned. And there's just a hint, well, more than a hint in some places, but a hint of questioning of what does this mean for the Confederacy? So it kind of mirrors some of what you see in the later Lost Cause, like the glory of the cause, whatever it is, in defeat after the war. That is, I don't know if you call it sort of foreshadowing in Stonewall Jackson's death, that there, it's something that must be remembered. And there's a tragedy in that loss that confirms the greatness of his sacrifice and the greatness of his deeds before his death. Does that make sense?
Yeah. How How did they spin that, that he was shot by his own men?
They just kind of glossed over it for the most part. They didn't talk about it a huge amount. There was a lot of just more emphasis on the tragedy and the loss and less emphasis on the details of what had actually happened.
Okay.
I mean, there's a lot. It's interesting because there's a lot of talk about, his final words, and he was he sort of lasted for a period of days. In a fever, maybe he had something like a pulmonary thrombosis from his wounds. It's a little, it's hard to say 100%, but he lingered for a few days, and his arm had been amputated, and he lingered for a few days and saw his wife. And so it had some of the trappings of the 19th century good death, like his family was able to come and see him. His men, right. Some of his aides were around him, as the fight was carrying on, as the news of his illness and is kind of getting to Lee and to other front lines as it's going on. So there is this kind of lingering. So there's that emphasis on him, I think, rather than exactly what had caused the wound. And of course, it was during the aftermath of battle at Chancellorsville. So it gets sort of lost in the fog of the story. I don't think there's a lot of emphasis on the details.
Did they not?
I'm not sure. Sorry, go ahead.
Did they not mention that he was shot by his own men at all, or did they just
sometimes not
downplay it?
Yeah,
okay.
Sometimes not, and I'm not sure. That was. I would have to look into it a little bit more. But for instance, I can't think of any time where the Northern press made any deal out of that, for instance, which they might have, certainly, right? There were lots and lots of Northern obituaries in both Democratic and Republican papers, and lots of writers who wrote about Jackson's death and how it was a tragedy for the Confederacy, and some of them framed that as a good thing, right? And so it's the kind of thing that they might have almost mocked Confederates for, and I can't think of even very much of that. So I think that it was rather quiet.
Yeah, even I think the Vanity Fair quote that you have in there, which was a humor magazine, even they, with their humor, had a little reverence and respect for the man. I can't remember if it was them or if it was another paper you quoted that said that basically they separate the man from the cause.
Yes,
and that you can do that.
That's possibly also, you could relate that to your previous question, which is maybe a little foreshadowing of the lost cause, of like the sort of admiration of Northern culture for the nobility of the lost cause. And, there's a lot of talk and a lot of really good scholarship about how Northerners basically started to accept the lost cause, by the 1880s or in later decades. But you could see it even here in 1863, where there's like, we can have respect for this great man. It's just too bad that he decided to use his talents to be a traitor.
Right.
That gets magnified when Robert E. Lee died in the early 1870s. There's more Northern praise for Lee than there was for Stonewall Jackson in the middle of the war. So I would say those Northern papers, even the humor papers, they're more critical of Jackson for what they would say, becoming a traitor, than they're willing to be after the war, even of Robert E. Lee. Though there are plenty of Northern Republicans who still are willing to call him a traitor.
Sure.
There's a similarity in there's still something to admire, kind of what you said. There's something heroic, and he certainly was a man of talent in anybody's. There's nobody who just writes him off as not worthy of attention. Let's put it that way.
It's interesting because for people like me who get frustrated by the lost cause religion, it sometimes is hard to, like, we want to blame the UDC and Jubal Early and all these things. But as you just kind of pointed out, it takes two to tango. And, the North had a lot to do with the acceptance of that nonsense.
Well, certainly, the widespread of it. You don't want to set aside the UDC or Jubal Early or any of those folks. They're definitely, trying on purpose.
They're more nefarious.
Right. In Reconstruction and beyond, to make the lost cause the predominant memory of the South. But it is still really important to see how a lot of, especially white Northerners, and in both cases we mean white Northerners and white
sure,
Northerners,
of course,
because most Black people didn't accept that at all, right?
Listen to the rest of this interview and dozens like it. Support the show and get early access to special episodes, early and discounted ticket sales, and more. The second lieutenant level and above gets access to all monthly Patreon episodes. So please go to patreon.com/addressinggettysburg, choose a tier, and join. And I thank you in advance.